Dear Minister of Health, please give me 3 minutes to talk about why more funds should be used to implement cultural safety mental health services and suicide prevention education to address the high suicide rates of indigenous people. Almost a quarter of all deaths were by suicide for those aged 0 to 44 years old First Nation people. Those suicide deaths are not just numbers, but also community members, families, friends, neighbors, work colleagues, and loved ones. As you can see in this graph, First Nations people experience 2.5 times higher suicide rates compared with non-Indigenous people. Even worse, it tends to increase. It goes against the SDG 3, ensure healthy life and promote well-being for all at all ages, and closing gap target 14, significant and sustained reduction in the suicide of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people towards zero, which is the gray line in the graph. Unfortunately, the reality is far from it. Suicide is not an individual thing, but also has a social impact. It affects families, communities, and the broader society. Suicide affects 95% of Aboriginal people in Australia. The effects can be across 2 or 3 generations. The whole society can benefit from reducing suicide mortality. Suicide deaths and attempts cost between $1.6 and $6 billion per year, directly or indirectly. The dark red is the percentage of the estimated daily cost of mental illness and suicide. It's approximately 1/10 of Australia's daily GDP. However, there are policymakers insisting rural and remote communities in Australia tend to have more socio-economic disadvantages due to a lack of access to education and employment opportunities. Thus, people who live in remote areas tend to have higher suicide rates. There are more Indigenous people living in remote areas, which is the main reason that the suicide rate among Indigenous people is higher than non-Indigenous people. Living in remote areas is one of the aspects that lead to a higher suicide rate. However, as the graph above shows, whether in remote area or not, suicide rates of Indigenous people are significantly higher than non-Indigenous people. So living remotely is not the main reason that causes the large diversity of the suicide rate. There is evidence shows the loss of culture affects Indigenous people in the long term, which is the risk factor of self-harm and suicide. Prioritizing understanding cultural diversity, using more funds to implement culturally appropriate services, and launching suicide prevention education to help people with self-harm behavior feel belonging and other people can also learn to identify the situation is especially important to address the high suicide rates of Aboriginal people. Thank you for listening.